Hi everyone, welcome again. Welcome to the second in this two-part series from Holy Family Catholic Church in Hillsborough, North Carolina, about some, not all, but some principles that we can keep in mind as Catholic Christians as we consider how we are going to vote in the upcoming elections. If you're watching this in the year 2024, we are specifically responding to the 2024 election season. But these principles, as I said last week, will apply in any election coming up anytime from 2024 on into the future. So I hope that this video remains useful no matter when you are joining us. Though, if you have been watching in 2024, thank you to the 53 who have already, in the week past, watched part 1 of this series. You can always go back to Holy Family's YouTube page, and on that channel find the part 1 to this series as well. We are also adding a page to the Holy Family website where explainer events such as this will be collected and posted on that online resource as well. So, to recap the things that we introduced last week's session with, we should begin by reviewing what this series is not. What I am not talking about when I talk about some principles for voting as a Catholic. I am not talking about instructions on how to vote on particular policies that are being advanced by any party or candidate in the 2024 election. I am not. This is the issue, and this is a yes or no that must be followed. That's not the kind of talk that this is. Nor is it specifically about the parties and the candidates or other assorted politicians of this election cycle. You are not going to hear me name any of the individual political parties, candidates, members of parties, talking heads from the media. They are not going to feature in this video. It is not a position statement on the part of Holy Family Parish or on the part of our pastor, Father Ryan Elder, or myself particularly, or anyone on staff to say, we, the parish in Hillsborough, take this position on this current political potato. We're not going to do that. And finally, for those of you who are here live, we don't have registration forms for you to fill out if you need to change your voter, county, or address or anything. However, since this is the last in the series, I do have, for those who are here live and who care in the 2024 election, a reminder that early voting sites open on October 18th. You may want to know if you are expecting an absentee ballot, that those have been delayed a couple weeks because there was a state Supreme Court case about whether someone needed to be removed from the ballots, but they'd already been printed, and they did need to be removed from the ballot, so they're being reprinted. So if anyone's waiting on an absentee ballot and don't know why you don't have it yet, it's coming. But that is the extent of what we're going to say in terms of voter registration or voting methods and procedures in this video. What it is, these two sessions put together constitute an overview of some of the fundamental Catholic principles of human dignity, which was the main topic of last week's session, and the social doctrine of the Church as a unified whole, which will be part of today's content. It is a very brief, very generalized list of resources and places to find information in greater depth about what the Catholic Church teaches as part of its coherent social doctrine and where you might go to find out more on a specific policy area or an aspect of moral theology that might interest you. It is going to evaluate some of the issues that are current events here in the year 2024, many of which I fully expect to remain current event, hot button political issues in the decades to come, and evaluate those issues in light of the principles of Catholic social teaching that you were introduced to tonight. Again, not evaluating particular policy recommendations about those issues, but exploring the issues themselves. And finally, for those who are with us live, I will build in some question and answer time so that we can, even in this setting, have a sort of back and forth, have a dialogue, be able to bring some parishioner questions into the conversation, things that I may not have thought to put into the presentation, but my answers would just as well be shared with you watching online. You can also put your own comments and questions into the com box on the YouTube link, on the YouTube page for this video. And I do promise to go in a couple times a week and see what's there and provide answers where appropriate, or links to other resources that would go into greater detail, depending on what kind of question it is. But everyone watching right now is more than welcome to engage through that medium as well. Last week, we looked at a pretty recent text that came out of the Vatican, not written by Pope Francis himself, but from his #1 office for interpreting and proclaiming doctrines of the faith, called Dignitas Infinita, about the surpassing and inalienable value of the principle that every human person has a dignity by virtue of being created and willed and loved by God, and how that human dignity plays out in an individual's self-assessment, in an individual's place within a social structure, and in the free choices that an individual makes, whether they align with, enhance, or seem to demean or tarnish that human dignity that they innately possess. And we looked at many current event issues in relation specifically to that lens of the dignity of the human person. Tonight, we will be looking at a text from the United States Bishops' Conference that is now between 10 and 20 years old, depending on what edition we're looking at, that includes a discussion of the principles of how we form our conscience in relation to the teachings that the Catholic Church offers us and the principles of social justice that they lay out, looking at specifically 4 of the principles of Catholic social teaching, though the other 3 will get wrapped into the conversation as we go along, and then providing you in the room, and a link, again, for those of you watching online, a link will be put in the description to the full text of this document from the Catholic bishops that goes into greater detail into individual current event issues of the 21st century and applies these principles in a more detailed and direct way to each of those. The name of the text we're considering tonight is Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, a call to political responsibility from the Catholic Bishops of the United States. This edition comes from the year 2015. Every election cycle, some sort of new introductory note gets added to it by the bishops to give some indication of how the foundational principles in the text might be applied, or how the current event situation might be evolving to justify or to explain, if it even needs justifying, why this statement of moral principles from the Catholic bishops is still worth looking at and worth digesting. And as I mentioned last week, if you want to go all the way to the textbook, if you will, the sort of catechism of the Catholic Church specifically on social doctrine, I would refer you to the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, now 20 years old, but again, the principles are timeless, even if some individual new political or policy or ethical issues have arisen in the past 20 years that were not thought of when Rome put this out in 2004, still, it is the most complete and most exhaustive description of the principles of Catholic social doctrine that you will find. I am working on producing a summarizing video of this book, probably 3 videos, that won't be done with a live audience. It'll just be me in my office, sort of going a paragraph at a time through each of the major sections of this text to give you a fuller idea of what is included there. I hope to have those up by October 17th, when early voting begins, so that we at Holy Family have exposed you to the widest possible set of resources for making your voting decisions. And then, in between the last session and this one, we got just about the newest and highest up source that one might be able to imagine, which is, while I was giving the presentation for September 11th, Pope Francis was in the middle of an East Asian visit, a tour of Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, and Singapore. And on his flight back from Singapore to Rome on Friday, he, as he always does, gives an in-flight interview with some of the journalists who accompany him. And during this in-flight interview, a CBS News reporter asked Pope Francis the following question and got the following answer, which I don't see how I can let this go without just reading it into the record, as it will, and letting this be the first foundation of our first question and answer time. So the CBS News journalist Anna Matrenga asked Pope Francis, "Your Holiness, you have always spoken in defense of the dignity of life. With the US elections coming up, what advice would you give a Catholic voter faced with a candidate who supports ending a pregnancy and another who wants to deport 11 million migrants?" And this is the answer that Pope Francis gave, in full, leaving nothing out from the transcript. Both are against life. The one that throws out migrants and the one that kills children. Both are against life. I can't decide. I'm not American and won't go to vote there. But let it be clear. Denying migrants the ability to work and receive hospitality is a sin, a grave sin. The Old Testament speaks repeatedly of the orphan, the widow, and the stranger, migrants. These are the 3 that Israel must care for. Failing to care for migrants is a sin against life and humanity. I celebrated Mass at the border near the Diocese of El Paso. There were many shoes from migrants who ended poorly there. Today there is a flow of migration within Central America, and many times they are treated like slaves because people take advantage of the situation. Migration is a right, and it was already present in sacred scripture and in the Old Testament, the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. Do not forget this. Then abortion. Science says that at 1 month after conception, all the organs of a human being are present. Everything. Having an abortion is killing a human being. Whether you like the word or not, it's murder. The church is not closed-minded because it forbids abortion. The church forbids abortion because it kills. It is murder. It is murder. And we need to be clear about this. Sending migrants away, not allowing them to grow, not letting them have life is something wrong. It is cruelty. Sending a child away from the womb of the mother is murder because there is life. And we must speak clearly about these things. No, but however, both things are clear. The orphan, the stranger, and the widow. Do not forget this. The CBS News journalist followed up, "In your opinion, Your Holiness, are there circumstances in which it is morally permissible to vote for a candidate who is in favor of abortion?" And Pope Francis responded, again, in full. "In political morality, it is generally said that not voting is ugly. It's not good. One must vote. And one must choose the lesser evil. Which is the lesser evil? That lady or that gentleman? Which is the closest that Pope Francis came to identifying the specific US politicians in question? I don't know. Each person must think and decide according to their own conscience. Not only a very timely answer, but just about the best lead-in that I could have asked for, so thank you, Your Holiness, if you ever watch this, into the first topic of tonight's session, which is how to form our own consciences, to know how to decide, and how to discern for ourselves what lesser evil we might find ourselves needing to choose. So, with that, first question and answer period begins, specifically really about what Pope Francis has said. Some of you here live may have heard that this happened or may not have, but probably had not been exposed to the entire sort of 4-paragraph statement before. So first I open it up to thoughts and reactions to His Holiness. Welcome, by the way. Very strong statement, yes. Mincing words is not how I would describe it either. Yeah, no, being very clear. He pretty immediately got some pushback, of course, because there is a sizable contingent within the church that does not want to equate actual murder, that is abortion, with other forms of injustice that yet preserve the life of a person, as usually, frequently, generally, maybe, happens in migration issues. But, of course, there is another sort of partisan-aligned camp within the American Catholic Church who has praised and thanked Pope Francis profusely for saying abortion is not, in fact, the only issue that we should be considering when we vote this year. That there are other equally nationally involving, and it was the CBS reporter who chose these two topics, abortion versus the immigration issue, to present to him. So it's not like he had these two lined up to be 50-50 equally strong issues in his head. It was what he was presented with. But there's no doubt that in the 11 years of his papacy so far, Pope Francis has repeatedly spoken very forcefully, as I think I mentioned last week, that the migration issues that come up in Dignitas Infinita as a current event issue being discussed have just as much to do with crossings from the Near East and North Africa across the Mediterranean into Europe as they do with the Central American migration issue. So even in Italy itself, Pope Francis has always consistently been very strong on the humane treatment of migrants and the welcoming and incorporating of them into the society where they wish to make a new home. Yes?
Why can't you be personally opposed to abortion and yet allow other people to make the decision themselves? Because it's between that person and God. It's not a political issue, really. But
Why can it not be so that someone has a personal opposition, morally grounded, morally informed to abortion, but does not consider that an issue or a position to be imposed on others through the voting in the election process? Is that about what you said?
yeah.
With that, let us move on to a look at forming consciences for faithful citizenship, where that issue does in fact come up. It won't be immediate, but it is going to be included. So, faithful citizenship, or forming consciences, FC is a nice abbreviation for either one. I'm going to say faithful citizenship. presents at the very beginning 4 questions that it intends to address, even before the document begins talking about specific American partisan policy issues. Just the initial 4 questions of principle that it wants to consider. The first one is, why does the church teach on issues affecting public policy at all? The second is, who are the members of the church that should be participating in political life? The third one is, how does the church help the Catholic faithful to speak about, give the faithful the vocabulary, the terminology, the structure of argument that we can use to speak about social and political questions? And finally, what does the church say about Catholic social teaching in the public square? We're actually going to address these tonight, 1, 2, 4, 3, but we will do all 4. So, to answer the question, why does the church bother? I've given you 2 quotes, and just like last week with Dignitas, Infinita, what is here in the booklet, in the official text, the full text, has much more argumentation and flow of logic and explaining itself than the sentences or pull quotes that I am providing here on the slides. So those of you who are here in person, you have a copy to take with you and read it at your leisure. Those of you watching online, again, the link will be in the description of the video. But simply put, the church's obligation to participate in shaping the moral character of society is a requirement of our faith, says our Conference of Catholic Bishops. It is a basic part of the mission we have received from Jesus Christ. So at the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28, at the very end, when he sends the 11 to go out, teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all that Jesus has commanded us, that is not only questions of faith, it is also questions of morals. It is both the content of our faith and how it is to be put into practice in our social interactions, in our community life and national life. The obligation to teach the moral truths that should shape our lives, including our public lives, is central to the mission given to the church by Jesus Christ. The bishops felt they basically needed to restate themselves and make this point twice in the opening section of the document. It is fulfilling the mission that Jesus left to the church, to speak not only on theological or philosophical issues, but on moral, ethical, social, societal issues as well. And what authority does the church have to do that in secular terms? The authority from Jesus for the church is obviously more than enough to justify the church making statements about moral issues. But even within society, what does the Catholic Church have to bring to the table in a discussion of the great social issues of our day? Well, 2,000 years of putting together a consistent moral framework for addressing the issues at hand, the political platforms that propose policy responses to these issues, and the campaigns that spread these policy ideas out into the public discourse. Moreover, 2,000 years of experience of doing social outreach, of doing social service through education, through family crisis intervention, through hospitals and other means of caring for the sick, homeless shelters, women in crisis outreach, especially crisis pregnancies, food banks, soup kitchens, all the various ways we feed the hungry, all of the services that the church in the U.S. provides at the borders to welcome immigrants and refugees and give them something better than the tent cities that are often provided by government contracts. and reaching out in international humanitarian aid also, global solidarity, not to mention the global Catholic Church's effort to cry out for peace and against war and violence, no matter where it is happening. So, the bishops lay out a pretty comprehensive argument that the Church is so much a societal actor, specifically in matters of humanitarian intervention, that it has more than earned the right to say its piece about the issues of our day. Which members of the Church should participate in political life and how? Should priests at Sunday Mass, or whoever's preaching, be making firm policy statements from the arrow? No. Bishops, priests, and deacons, the ordained clergy, are tasked with handing down the teachings of the Church, moral teachings and social teachings, fundamental moral principles, as I, in my own not ordained way, am doing right now, giving guidance on the moral dimensions of public decisions that we may be called upon to make, and encouraging the lay faithful to actively participate in public life, including political life. It is for the lay faithful, those of us who are not ordained to anything, who are sort of what used to be considered rank and file members of the Church for many centuries, but one of the great advances that has come to the global Church since the Second Vatican Council has been this recognition that the lay members of the Church are fundamentally the Church, and those ordained ministers have a task of service and ministry to us, to empower us to go and spread the gospel message and build the kingdom of heaven on earth through our own family, neighborhood, community, national, state level, global engagement. And so it is the direct duty of the lay faithful to work for a just ordering of society. We are called to form our consciences in accord with Catholic teaching, and then do what we feel a vocation to do, whether that is run for office ourselves, join the inner workings of political parties, or volunteer with them, or do the canvassing, depending on what we are driven and motivated and captivated to do. Communicate with our own elected officials to voice our own positions and our own preferences for how we want those we elect to vote on our behalf, and to join any kind of community organizations, social initiatives, service societies, humanitarian aid groups, to even outside of the governmental system, outside of the legislative or executive system, to contribute our part to instantiating the social doctrine of the Church in the here and now. And from there, faithful citizenship chooses 4 principles of Catholic social teaching to organize itself around as it begins to explore, at least from the broad view, the issues at hand in most American 21st century political discourse. They begin with dignity of the human person, which is the foundation of a moral society, and there's very little that I need to say tonight about that because that was the entire topic of last week's session. The next principle is subsidiarity, which is the social principle that larger institutions should not interfere with or overwhelm state or local institutions where those smaller institutions are closer to the actual lived needs of human persons and have the most intimate and direct knowledge of what kind of intervention is needed for them to provide the basics of what they need to be able to flourish. And to the extent possible, organizations higher up the chain should give those smaller local institutions the freedom that they need to respond as they see fit to the needs that they perceive. Among these smaller institutions, excuse my voice, among these smaller institutions that are specifically singled out by the U.S. bishops, there is the institution of the family, the vital cell, the fundamental cell or unit of society, which is where children learn more than anywhere else what it means to be a member of the society that they live in, an institution that should be defended and strengthened. And within that, the rights that parents have and the obligation, the responsibility, the duty that parents have to provide care for their children in keeping with their own moral values, including, but not limited to, choosing the means by which their child will be educated, and the location and the provider for that education. And then within community associations, within any sort of local institution that a person might choose to join or affiliate themselves with, every person and every association has equally a right and a responsibility or duty to do their part to help shape the society that they operate in to be more in keeping with coherent moral principles. There is much more that could be said about subsidiarity. These are the particular issues that the bishops have highlighted in faithful citizenship. As we continue to move up from the individual human person to the lower level institutions that can do direct engagement in social life, we move up to the societal or national or cultural or regional common good. That sum total of conditions that need to obtain for the persons who are members of that society to be able to flourish. This includes the right to life, and it also includes the right to access things that are required for decent, dignified, as we said last week, human living. Food and shelter, good education, stable and gainful employment, adequate health care, access to health resources, access to decent housing, freedom to exercise their religion, and freedom of family life. Freedom to give persons the opportunity to pass down their own moral principles within the generations of their own family. And there are many economic issues that come under that, many environmental issues that come under that are briefly alluded to in the sort of part 1 of faithful citizenship as all things that work together to constitute the sum total of goods that is the common good. And finally, the principle of solidarity, which reaches out beyond one particular society or cultural group or political boundary and reaches out into other groups as well. Globally, internationally, across state lines, across ethnic or cultural lines, we are also called to work for an end to racism, extreme poverty, extreme disease, not only in our own neck of the woods, within our own milieu, but for our neighbors as well. for immigrants, to make sure that they have access to a decent home, access to decent education, access to a decent family life, a decent environment to bring their family along with them and provide a new stable base to exist on and to grow from. It includes just war theory. It includes all sorts of international, diplomatic, and military issues and occurrences. Specifically, that the use of force, the use of violence, should only ever be invoked as a last resort when all diplomatic measures have failed, and that non-combatants should always be specially protected and shielded from involvement in the violence of war to the fullest extent possible. And a special emphasis on the preferential option for the poor, which is that special priority that the church gives to those who are on the margins of society, either socially or economically, or even just geographically in that sort of no man's land between major municipalities or civic reach, to give special emphasis to the basic needs that they need met just to be able to have any amount of freedom in their life, to dedicate themselves to participating in social life, to exercise their own religious freedom, to seek their own relationship with God, even, without constantly being distracted and deterred from those goods by an unending need to figure out where tonight's food is going to come from. That constitutes mostly, except for the part about how to form a conscience, which is the next unit. Part one, the sort of general principles section of faithful citizenship. Again, to recap, the church has a mission from Jesus to complete, and that includes preaching on social issues. The church brings a coherent moral framework and centuries or millennia of involvement in social services to the table, and has that to provide. And the church especially, and the bishops of the United States, want to call special attention to those areas of societal issues that involve, or that specifically require consideration of the dignity of the human person, the principle of subsidiarity, by which the localest and smallest and nearest institutions to the needs of the people should be given as much freedom and support as possible to do their own work. The common good, the sum total of conditions that need to obtain for human persons in that society to flourish, and solidarity, the impetus to reach outside of our own societal, cultural, ethnic, regional, national boundaries and extend aid and support as we are able to respond to these same common good needs with our neighbors as well. This leads us into our next question and answering period. To sort of approach an answer where you might be able to guess an answer to your question that's coming, or do we still need to get there? Possibly, yeah.
Can you define what you mean by higher, the one slide, what word was used, higher?
Sort of higher level institutions versus lower.
Can you give an example of a higher level institution?
So, in a very governmental way of looking at it, just to start from there, no one from the national government should be unduly interfering with or preventing the ability of the mayor's office in one particular city or the town council of a particular area to figure out how to direct their resources to best respond to the needs of that city.
Like US county government as that higher.
That is frequently the context in which you're going to hear subsidiarity talked about. You could just as easily say it about McDonald's, the international conglomerate, telling franchisees how to handle sick time for their employees. That would also be a sort of subsidiary way of looking at it. Let the individual store manager figure out what to do with their employees when there's a hurricane on, and not just be beholden to a set of policies from the international level, from the sort of, they haven't actually worked behind the counter in decades, that kind of thing. So it doesn't have to be governmental, but when it comes to policy issues, it frequently is. Any other responses, comments? All right. So then, a well-formed conscience. What is conscience? Just to remind ourselves what the actual Catholic philosophical definition of what the human conscience is. Because many of us, if we have grown up with Disney movies in our lives, will, as soon as we hear the word conscience, see Jiminy Cricket floating down with his open umbrella in front of Pinocchio, saying, a conscience is that still, small voice that people don't listen to. That's just the trouble with the world today. Well, that's not quite it. That's not exactly what philosophically we mean by conscience. Conscience is a faculty of human reason. Conscience is an actual process, a deliberate process that our center of reason, our rational faculty, goes through. A process that it initiates and completes to determine what is right and wrong in the choice that sits before us. It is the voice of God, if it is the voice of anyone, which is not meant to be a still, small voice. The voice of God resounding in the human heart, revealing the truth to us, and calling us to do what is good while shunning what is evil. And if a Catholic is going to embark on this lifelong process of forming their conscience in line with the teachings of the Church, this requires 3 fundamental steps, namely the desire to embrace goodness and truth, the desire to commit oneself to learning what is truly good, what is truly true in how human society is meant to function, how human relationships are meant to function, and then to examine the facts and the background information of the various choices or options that they are presented with, including the background of the scenario in which these options, to which these options are responding, and then to take all of that into prayer, to reflect on it in an environment of prayer, to sit with the Lord, to sit with the Holy Spirit, and actually do the work of conscience, choosing the option that best pursues good and avoids evil within your individual context. And I might just say here on the side, since it would be impossible and take up all of our waking hours to be trying to do research on every single political issue that we are called to vote on, every time one candidate sends like a 10 points in their last term, they did these wonderful things for the economy, and this person threatens to do these 10 awful things to the economy, to then have to go and fact check every one of those, looking for those facts and background information, it's too much to expect. Which is one reason why the Church constantly, over and over again, at the American level and at the Vatican level, calls on communications media and journalists and reporters and commentators to take their job of providing the people with an accurate summary of the facts and the background information that is still faithful to the coherent moral framework that provides for the common good. In other words, the church's moral framework. Why that role in society is so vital, and why reporters and commentators must be very diligent, especially if they aren't Catholics themselves, very diligent in living up to and in trying to present to their readership or their viewership that approach to their reporting on the political issues of the day. Deeply involved in the formation of a conscience is the virtue of prudence. There are 4 what are called cardinal virtues, those hinges on which the rest of a life of virtue swing, that are fortitude, or brave, courageous endurance, temperance, or moderation, prudence here, and justice, giving each and every person what is their rightful due based on the dignity they possess and the office that they hold, the position that they hold. In this case, prudence shapes and informs our ability to deliberate over available alternatives, to determine what is most fitting to a specific context, and to act decisively. So one could perhaps say that as one goes through the work of forming their conscience well over and over again, and develops this habit of listening for the voice of God telling us how to do good and avoid evil, committing ourselves to the search for goodness and truth, committing ourselves to finding accurate and morally informed information about the choices in front of us, and then prayerfully reflecting on the options that are available to us, we build the habit of doing this over and over again. And a virtue is nothing else than a consistent habit deliberately chosen to do what is good. And that habit, once instilled in us, makes the act of our conscience all that much quicker and more intuitive for us to see as God sees what is good and evil in the choices in front of us. Central principles to be considered when thinking prudentially about an issue: a good end does not justify an immoral means. One may not do evil knowing that it is evil, with the intention that this is a likely way for good to come out of it. A, because that still involves doing evil, and B, because consequences can never be seen with perfect foresight. And so it is not even a valid foundation, consequentialism, to base your moral reasoning on. Not all courses of action are morally acceptable. We must not fall into the bad habit of thinking of the options at our disposal as equally valid, equally acceptable, just because, for example, in a 2 major party system, one advocates this course of action and one the other, and that one has a base of 33% of the country, and that one has a base of 33% of the country, and there's another third in the middle, so they seem pretty evenly distributed. We must not fall into the trap of letting ourselves think that therefore the options themselves in a moral sense are actually equally weighted. Public opinion and moral rectitude are not the same. And finally, where Catholics cannot differ, though in the exercise of prudence they may differ on the course of action that they choose to commit themselves to or that they choose to vote in favor of, Catholics cannot differ on the fact, the principle that we have a moral obligation to take part in building a better world that better creates the common good through morally acceptable means. Catholics should at least all be able to agree that we have ourselves committed to making a better world for ourselves and future generations, but that we have to do it in an ethically upstanding way. So, doing good and avoiding evil. Faithful citizenship provides a list of acts that it calls either intrinsically evil or unjustifiable. When this text first came out in the early 2000s, the aughts, around about 2007, some of you who have been in Catholic public discourse for a while may remember that between this text and certain things from encyclicals of John Paul II, Catholic discourse sort of built up an unshakable and a sort of perfect and complete package of 5 intrinsically evil acts that many in Catholic public discourse would then hold out and say, all right, these are the 5. If there's a candidate who publicly endorses any of these 5 things, that candidate is definitely endorsing intrinsic evils, and therefore we are absolutely not allowed as Catholics to vote for them. What that package, what that presentation missed, is all of the other issues in exactly the same 2 paragraphs of faithful citizenship that the bishops also laid out as being in all ways unjustifiable. And so we need to open ourselves to the possibility that the bishops had a certain amount of synonymity in mind as they laid out things that they named as intrinsically evil, things in the next sentence that they named as unjustifiable, things in the next paragraph that they would name as intrinsically evil, things later in that paragraph that they would name as unjustifiable. And it is wrong for us to pick them apart and say, something might be unjustifiable, but if it's not intrinsically evil, then we can let ourselves slide into this trap of setting aside these things that indeed are unjustifiable, but we really need to focus ourselves on this batch of current issues. And I think our public discourse suffered quite a bit from strictly separating sets of issues that really ought always to have been taken more or less as one single coherent package as they were originally presented in the text Faithful Citizenship itself. So you find abortion, euthanasia, human cloning, embryonic stem cell research, and same-sex marriage. That was the original 5-point package of intrinsic evils, rather, intrinsically evil acts that in Catholic public discourse was frequently shopped around as this is the neat and tidy 5 no-nos. Absolutely cannot support a candidate who would advocate for these positions. Of course, genocide, torture, the intentional targeting of non-combatants, acts of racism, treating workers as mere means to an end, providing them with subhuman living conditions, treating the poor as disposable in any way. Though they tend to all be larger, sometimes more nebulous, harder to pin down as individual acts, yet they do remain unjustifiable in any way. And if targeting non-combatants intentionally in war is completely unjustifiable, it stands to reason, it would follow that Catholics should also be very hesitant, resist as far as possible, endorsing a candidate who endorses either doing that themselves through their own nation's military actions, or giving open military support to another country that is credibly accused of doing that. So unjustifiable acts, though not labeled intrinsically evil acts at every point along the way in the text of faithful citizenship, bind our consciences in very much the same way. And we ought to take those into consideration as profoundly contrary to the moral law as we deliberate on our voting preferences. Now, not only negative prohibitions are included here in faithful citizenship. There's a lot so far that we've seen of you really may not vote this for in this circumstance if there is a candidate or a party that endorses these absolutely reprehensible positions. But there are positives as well. Opposition to intrinsically evil acts should also open our eyes to the good that we must do, to contribute to our positive duty to contribute to the common good and to act in solidarity with those in need. Both opposing evil and doing good are essential obligations. And so, in our voting deliberations, we also run the risk of limiting ourselves to the negative checklist. Does the candidate we're thinking about hold unacceptable policy positions on these or those, without also asking ourselves, will this candidate in question advance positive principles of building up civil society, building up the common good, giving a preferential option to the poor, caring for our environment and our common home, upholding the rights and responsibilities of lower institutions, etc. I've been building up to this for a while. This is the point where faithful citizenship just lays it out outright. Let us not be tempted towards a moral equivalence in which there are no ethical distinctions between the various issues of life and dignity. For example, because opinions are fairly evenly held among the populace. Nor should we fall into the temptation to misuse the list of intrinsic evils or unjustifiable acts to dismiss or ignore other issues that do also hold a serious claim on our consciences. Choices about how best to respond may be matters for principled debate, but that does not make them optional concerns. Now, exercising our prudential judgment in the moment of choosing. Abundantly clear. Strict quotation from our Bishops' Conference. Those who knowingly, willingly, and directly support public policies or legislation that undermine fundamental moral principles, those who do that are cooperating with evil. I wish we had the time in this talk to distinguish formal and material, proximate and remote forms of cooperation with evil. Time does not permit this. What I want to move on to is faithful citizenship's discussion of when you're already in a situation, politically, legislatively, where you can't shove the rabbit back into the hat, where morally flawed laws already exist. And we have to accept that drafting new legislation to try to push the law code back towards moral coherence may be able to restore a situation of justice only partially, only piecemeal, only gradually over a series of legislative interventions. And so, as we consider policy options, we should also consider that we don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Some progress is better than none, even if it doesn't achieve a perfect moral solution to a social issue all at once. And so, we use this partial, gradual approach to improving the civic situation of our society while still resisting cooperating with evil when we apply moral principles to specific policy choices. Not all choices, as we said, are equally valid. And the guidance of the church's moral teaching is not just one political opinion or one policy preference among all of the others that are being voiced by all of the special interests that are also involved in the political process. Church guidance, as we've seen, has a special claim because it flows directly from the mission that Jesus has entrusted to the church, and it flows from an institution's 2,000-year history of commitment to this mission and tremendous innovation and success at doing so. So a Catholic cannot vote for a candidate who favors a policy that promotes an intrinsically evil act if the intent of the voter is to give their support to that candidate's position. That, with all of the underlines there and present, should not be controversial. If a Catholic is voting for a candidate specifically because they share the immoral position on that policy issue that the candidate shares, this is wrong. A voter should not use the fact that their preferred candidate opposes this intrinsic evil as a way of justifying the fact that their candidate is paying no attention at all to other equally important moral issues. If we're going to vote for a candidate because of their stance on some intrinsic evil, opposed to some intrinsic evil, that doesn't absolve us from operating within the framework of our political system to still raise our voice to encourage that candidate to take a more morally coherent view of the common good in other policy areas as well. A Catholic who rejects a candidate's position on an intrinsic evil. There is a candidate who supports an intrinsic evil. A Catholic rejects that position. May yet reasonably decide to vote for that candidate for other truly grave moral reasons. Examples are not provided by the bishops of how exactly you would negotiate that distinction. But just because a candidate has a clearly morally unacceptable position on some intrinsic evil, that does not necessarily mean that candidate must be rejected to court, completely out of court. Because in the sum total of policy positions that the candidates hold, there may be other truly grave moral considerations to take into account, into consideration. And this is what we've been building up to, when all candidates, coming full circle back to Pope Francis's in-flight statement at the beginning of this talk, when all candidates hold positions that promote intrinsic evils, the voter may decide to not vote at all, which Pope Francis called ugly and not good, and which the U.S. bishops call an extraordinary step to take. The presumption should always be that Catholics make their positions heard in the voting booth. Or it is permissible for a Catholic to vote for the candidate who is deemed less likely to advance their morally flawed positions and more likely to adequately pursue other true, valid human goods. So do not listen to anyone who says one candidate is immediately unacceptable, immediately cut from consideration, stricken from consideration because of one policy position. It may well be true that your conscience decides, yes, whatever other issues the opposing major candidate has, this is entirely beyond the pale. I cannot in good conscience vote for this. You may. But do not let yourself be told by anyone that at the highest level, at a sort of bird's eye view of the situation, that candidate is beyond the pale because of that one policy issue. How to decide? Be guided by a well-formed conscience. Take into account the commitments, character, integrity, and ability to actually influence the issue of which their position is in question of each candidate. And reserve that decision to the individual conscience of the individual Catholic who is genuinely trying in good faith to conform themselves to the moral teaching of the Church. So to come around, finally, to put in some sort of plain answer a response to the question, why can a Catholic who opposes abortion personally from a principled moral standpoint, is it permissible for that Catholic to then say, however, it is not mine to impose that principled moral position on others who may hold a different set of moral principles and may not want that particular door forced open or closed on them? The answer would seem to be, whether it's abortion or any other absolutely unjustifiable or intrinsically evil act, that the Church's moral framework is coherent, is consistent. And if it is true, if it is really true, if it is true at the God level, if it is truly written into the right functionality of our society, of human persons relating to each other, then it's best to vote to build a society that reflects that. And yes, the consciences of others may disagree, but if we are committed to forming our consciences in according with this coherent moral framework that the body of Jesus left behind after his ascension and ensouled by the Holy Spirit has given us, then yeah, we have an obligation to work for the common good, which includes that in the way that we vote and in the way we want to see our government structure a society. And you can say that about abortion. You can also say that about, what shall we say? Let's take something from that list of unjustifiable acts that has a partisan valence of today on the other side. So, making sure that no one is living in a slum. Making sure that absolutely everyone in our society is living in a decent home. Making sure that those who are entering our nation, wanting to become part of our society, are given the same, what shall we say, the same fair shot, the same access to basic social goods. And by social goods, I don't mean like the prerogatives of citizenship. I mean housing and work and the ability to raise a family and get them educated. Get your kids educated as you see fit. In all of these ways, things that are left-coded and things that are right-coded in today's discourse, if we are people of conviction that the moral teaching of the church, the social teaching of the church, has captured better than any other society, any other position, more fully and coherently and perfectly than any other voice out there, the intention for human relations that God wrote into us and that guarantees and fulfills the guarantees of our human dignity, then yeah, we shouldn't be afraid. We shouldn't be hesitant to stand up and say, this is what's best for my society. I vote in favor of building the common good. And for me, the principles that speak most to my heart, that I am called to advocate for by my voting decisions and my policy involvement as a layperson, as a member of society, whatever it is that my conscience impels me to choose, yes, I'm not afraid to say that I think it's best for everybody. And that the world should function this way. And the ideal, the kingdom of God on earth, is when we get all 8 billion of us aligned in one coherent moral framework, and everyone intuitively sees that this is the best way for society to be built. That very likely won't happen before the last trumpet, but that's what we're going for. That's what we're aiming for. And that is all I have. So we here inside, well, okay, no, it's not all I have. There's one more slide, which you can read on your own. Just heroic commitment. This is specifically for the politicians, this last slide. That politicians themselves need to be Catholic if they're Catholic, and be unafraid to stand up and say, this is a coherent moral framework that I am committed in my public life to advancing. But it applies equally to the process of voting. So with that, we have reached the end. And question and answer will continue here live for a little bit longer as everyone's availability allows. But for those of you watching online, thank you very much. Please use the com box on this page to put your own responses, your own comments. Early voting begins in the year 2024 on October 17th. General election day is November 5th. Form your conscience. Vote if you think there is any possible way that you can reconcile your conscience with the options at hand. You may take the extraordinary step not to vote, but really do find any possible way to voice your conscience at the ballot box. And may God be with you as you decide. Thank you. Then you'll turn it off. Okay, so before the ladies of Cristo Vivo bang the doors down.
I think there's 2 key points to think about regarding your question. And one is what, as far as
Continue, you can cut it.